Hello, folks. We're going to cover some interesting things that relate to Chapter 5. There's a lot of Bob Dylan reference in there, but where did Bob Dylan get his influences? What drove him to his style? He came out of the Greenwich Village kind of scene, correct? Mm-hmm. And there was a whole folk movement, acoustic guitar music that was driving that scene. So you can't really speak about Bob Dylan without talking about his roots, and the things that were happening in those days were very much acoustic guitar driven. Mm-hmm. So chords on the guitar were the accepted accompaniment for all of the songs that were being written. The guitar ended up being the perfect medium because it's very portable. They were not very expensive. The people didn't have a lot of money to invest in instruments. And it's also relatively easy to learn to play chords. So chords are the basic language of the guitar. There's a handful of them that every guitar player knows. A chord is just a pattern of notes that stack up to, in music, a triad, which they just sound good together. So here's a basic C chord. And you see there's just 3 fingers that are touching here, so that's not very difficult. There's a D chord, E. There are the minor chords, which have a little bit different quality. So there's an A minor, D minor, E minor. And so people found that with just a handful of chords, they could be very expressive. And so the elaboration of how they use those chords is sort of an interesting stylistic thing in itself. So Brett, tell us about like strumming patterns and rhythmic patterns that were used.
Yeah, so chords were, the vehicle for a lot of these, basically the poetry, and the melody and the things that guys like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and others were speaking about. And as Terry said, that sort of comes back from a folk background from the Woody Guthrie in the 1930s and 40s even. And so chords, there's a couple different ways you can play them. And the most common way is to use either your pick or your fingers just to sort of strum them. So again, just the same chords that we were just talking about there. If you take a C chord and you go to an E chord, you can put a melody over that and you have yourself a pop tune. And of course, there's just a ton of variety depending upon how you put these things together. But there's not really hard and fast rules about what things you can and can't do with these chords. So that was also attractive too, because it sort of left for a lot of creative interpretation from a lot of these artists. And I'd say this influenced in the next chapter a lot of what the Beatles did too, because the Beatles were using a lot of open chords and things that came from singer-songwriters, and they were sort of in cahoots with those guys, I'd say. Yeah. So you can do, aside from strumming these chords just like sort of the traditional way with a pick or your fingers, you can also play with your fingers and do something that's almost kind of harkens back to an earlier time in music, something that I primarily study. It's classical guitar. And with that, you're using your fingers to play the chords. So in this, all you're doing, it's something called an arpeggiation of the chord. And so you can play those shapes in any order that you want to, and you're kind of just picking whatever notes from that chord you want to. So it can give the illusion of sort of playing a lot more notes, or there's a lot more activity in the performer. And a lot of tunes, if you listen to any of the Bob Dylan songs, he's doing a lot of things where he's kind of playing around with that concept. And so anyhow, so if you take a progression, the same one we just did here with a C major chord, minor. To D major. And then maybe you do something where you go, which is sort of a variation on that. I'm playing an open string. So it allows the guitarist to sort of almost have a melody, a counter melody, or something else going on in your hands.
Yeah, and there were some other sort of established patterns. There was a man named Merle Travis who was, I would say, more of a country western artist, and he developed a way of arpeggiating using that right hand pattern, but he had a unique thing where he had an alternating bass where he would pluck a bass note and then he'd go to a bass note lower. Then he would put a picking pattern on top of that, which was called Travis picking. And I don't think that was ever incorporated into this idiom at all, but it certainly was influential that you could use your fingers to arpeggiate and do a pattern that you could sing against and write melodies against.
Yeah, and that's another thing that these folks did a lot is they used something called a capo. And a lot of these tunes that you'll hear, they are played in different keys. And all a capo does, basically, if this is the strings of the guitar, the open strings of the guitar, you're basically just putting you're making it relatively go higher. So it's the same notes, but now you can sing and you can do those same things in a different key. So if I'm here, that's the C and the E chord transposed. And it's an incredibly versatile way to do this, especially if you're a novice guitar player or not a very advanced guitar player.
To play that same thing without that capo becomes really complex. So you have to do this. And so it's a lot more tricky to play all that really complicated bar chords and getting your fingers stretched out. So it was a very useful tool for someone with just a limited chord vocabulary. They could play in any key by using a capo. So I think that's a pretty good background of where Dylan's language originated and how it got to him.
So try to listen for that when you're listening to these songs that you have in this chapter. Try to listen for what techniques they're doing and sort of immerse yourself in that a little bit, and it's can make the understanding of the music a little bit better.